An English gentleman, Mark Catesby, set out for Carolina in 1722. He journeyed far inland at a time when really the European influence on the landscape was pretty fresh. What did he encounter? Where did he go? And how has the Carolina that we know today changed? Join me on today's expedition as we begin to rediscover Catesby's Carolina. Mark Catesby was an early 18th century British naturalist. His visits to the New World began in 1712 with his journey to Williamsburg, Virginia. He traveled in Virginia and the West Indies and returned to England in 1719. His intrepid sense of adventure led wealthy patrons to send him back to the New World with the hopes of receiving natural history treasures to grow their collections and to grow in their gardens. Catesby journeyed back to America in 1722 and based his explorations from Charleston. At this time, the British settlements extended inland only about 60 miles from the Carolina coast. Beyond this, most of Carolina was managed and controlled by Native Americans. It was into this territory that Catesby walked hundreds of miles, not once, but twice, in 1723 and again in 1724. He traveled once in the spring and again in autumn to observe a full range of the plants and animals in the region. We know that he based his explorations of the upstate at an outpost called Fort Moore. But beyond this, historians have been at a loss to explain fully where he traveled or how far up the Savannah River he went. His publication of the natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, adorned with its beautiful illustrations, earned him the love and respect of many to this day. And it also aroused interest in the natural history of Carolina. It's the illustrations that most people know Catesby from, but my interest is much deeper. He collected thousands of plants and animals while here and sent them back to England. His notes and his collections, combined with the words he printed in the natural history, can allow us a glimpse into a very different look at what Carolina was like at the dawn of the dramatic change that would come from the European subjugation of the land. My colleagues, Amy and Chris Blackwell and Mark Spencer from the Natural History Museum London and I have combined forces to make the relics that Catesby collected and the words he penned available to everyone through our Botanica Caroliniana website. And we have used the full bounty of Catesby to generate hypotheses that can answer some of the most puzzling ecological questions in Carolina. His importance to the natural history is evident in the very names of the plants and animals found here. Some plant species get named after their discoverers, or sometimes just in honor of someone that the botanist describing the plant either admires or that maybe helped him fund his work. Well, Mark Catesby has a great number of plants that are named after him. And one of the really cool things about being one of the first botanists to really collect plants in North America means that the prettiest things aren't taken and they can be named after you. So this one in the spring here in the Carolinas is one of the most beautiful of all of our wildflowers. This delicate pink flower with parts in threes is called Catesby's Trillium, Trillium catesbii, and obviously named in honor of Mark Catesby, but also just one of the most splendid springtime plants, and called Trillium because the parts come in threes. It has 3 leaves, 3 sepals, 3 petals, 6 stamens, and a 3 or 6 parted ovary, all in multiples of 3, so Trillium, great name for the genus of this plant, and Catesbii is the Latinized form of Mark Catesby's name. One of the most beautiful plants of the spring, named after Mr. Catesby, one of the most beautiful plants in the summer, and believe it or not, even to me, what is the most beautiful of the fall flowering gentians. So being the first, it has its rewards. It's not just plants, it's animals too. The bullfrog, the king of North American frogs, is Rana catesbiana, after Catesby. So many organisms we love today carry his name. But what did Catesby get really excited about? With all the incredibly beautiful plants that Catesby encountered during his visits to Carolina, which one was his favorite? Believe it or not, this one, mountain laurel. Kalmia latifolia, a plant that for us who grew up in Appalachia, this is a common plant. It coats the hillsides throughout most of the southern Appalachians. But Catesby didn't encounter it quite as commonly as I did when I was growing up. You see, it kind of tells us a little bit about where Catesby's route was and what was going on in the landscape around him in the way that he describes where he found this plant. He describes this plant as growing here and there on rocky bluffs and overhangs over the streams and rivers, in places that would have been sheltered from fire, for one thing, but also on little microsites, microclimates, north-facing slopes, steep slopes, acid soils, where there might be slightly cooler climate, the kind of place where we still find mountain laurel, not just confined to the mountains, but all the way down the Savannah River drainage, all the way into Jasper County, almost to the coast. You can find mountain laurel. We certainly can't make any definitive statements about where Catesby went because he saw mountain laurel. It has far too broad a range. But it's hard not to agree with Catesby that this is one of the most beautiful plants in Carolina. The coloration is widely variable. This population that we're in right now has very white flowers with these small purple streaks in them. The coloration varies to really dark, and in fact, the watercoloring that Catesby did is of an extremely dark flowered individual, one that's much more similar to a cultivated form that we see today. And I want to share this story with you. When you look at these stamens, the anthers, the part that contains the pollen is held way back here in these sacs, sort of hidden in these projections. And the stamens are bent outward and they're actually under pressure. They want to spring free. And when a large insect lands on this flower, boom, all that pollen flies out, lands on the back of the insect, and is carried to the next flower. Now, during Catesby's time, just like today, the primary pollinator that would visit these flowers that would cause that to spring are going to be things like bumblebees, native bees to South Carolina. It's amazing to see that this plant is actively choosing its pollinator.
We know very little about where Mark Catesby traveled beyond his visits to Fort Moore. There simply weren't many place names for him to reference at the time. The route he took to get there is even in question. There are clues in the plants he collected. Our research has shown that some of the plants have ranges that are highly restricted to particular soil or rock types, like Delphinium carolinianum. Others have ranges that are restricted to particular geographical areas, like Lysimachia fraseri. What we think we can piece together today from studying his collections is that his main route up or down from Fort Moore was the Savannah River, though he may have made an overland trip to Fort Moore and returned via the Savannah. One thing we believe we can answer today is how far up the Savannah drainage he traveled, thanks to his collections.
One of the real mysteries and questions about Catesby's journeys is how far he got. He tells us that he came within sight of the Appalachian Mountains. We know he went to Fort Moore, but how far did he go beyond that? Well, the collections that he has made tell us far more concrete evidence about where we think he might have gone to and how far abroad he may have journeyed, because the collections aren't all represented by drawings, by watercolors, and then lithographs in the natural history. Two plants sort of solidify to me that he made it at least to within sight of the Appalachian Mountains, places like maybe Anderson or southern Pickens, southern Maconie County. One of them is right beside me. You see, he collected this plant. This is Hydrangea radiata. And Catesby's specimens are so well preserved that not only can we see the sterile bracts that surrounded the flowers on this fruiting specimen, but we can still see the coloration that gives this plant its common name.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
The white leaf or silver leaf hydrangea. In addition to this, he collected another southern Blue Ridge escarpment endemic, one that wouldn't be described for well over 100 years after he collected it, a plant called Lysimachia fraseri, Fraser's loosestrife. Those two plants together, taken collectively, provide me with all the evidence I need to know that he got at least as far as the southernmost, lowest downstream population of Lysimachia fraseri in Anderson County. In my opinion, this intrepid explorer braved it all the way up to places like this. Another interesting question that Catesby can help us answer is what the distribution of plants originally was at the time of European contact. Plants like silver maple and arrowleaf sida are examples of plants that Catesby is helping us to interpret, but there are other, showier examples. One of the most surprising and important contributions that Mark Catesby has made to our understanding of our flora and fauna is to help us to really get at what's native, what is truly Carolinian. And the tree behind me is an excellent example. This is southern Catalpa, and every single major flora and treatment of the plants and trees of the southern United States will tell us that that tree is only native to the East Gulf coastal plain. It only ranges east to places like the panhandle of Florida and southwestern Georgia naturally. Well, Catesby might make us change our minds about that. Catesby encountered this plant not in the East Gulf coastal plain, but here in South Carolina in 1723 and 1724. He collected 2 specimens that are in the Sloane Herbarium and 1 that's at Oxford, and the labels are pretty telltale. This plant was cultivated even by the late colonial times, and Catesby himself in his natural history tells us that he kind of takes responsibility for making it a popular plant in the colony. His labels actually tell us even more of the story and make a more convincing argument, because one of his labels in the Sloane Herbarium reads like this:
"They grow by riversides, very remote from the settlements, in rich land. Catalpa, called so by the Indians."
Well, that description, far away from the settlements, really removes the major argument that most people have had by saying that this was a plant that was introduced to the Carolinas from the East Gulf coastal plain, because he says they were growing far from the settlements along the rivers, in this case, probably the Savannah River. Today, they still grow here in South Carolina, along the banks of the Savannah River, and also here in the South Carolina Botanical Garden. This is just one example of many examples of plants that had obscure native ranges in the past, and today we think of as being true members of the Carolina community. Catesby's contribution to science is greater than just understanding what occurs here. Did you ever wonder where the passenger pigeon got its name? Catesby called it the pigeon of passage, and his ideas about bird movements are probably one of his greatest contributions to science. I always love going far afield, way over to the Great Plains, and finding something that can bring a connection right back home for me, right back to my home in the Carolinas. And these birds that are feeding out here are just that bird. Those are bobolinks. And that beautifully colored male, believe it or not, is a species of blackbird. And they, at least during migration, form huge flocks, and they're going to go from their breeding habitat, which is mostly centered in the northern Great Plains, all the way south to southern South America. They travel a huge distance in migration, a long ways for a songbird. We don't have many songbirds that go that far. They're moving kind of on the scale of many of the shorebirds that we have here, like the upland sandpiper. But the reason I say this brings a connection home is that we find these birds in the low country of South Carolina during migration. And believe it or not, they used to be called the rice birds because they do feed on seeds and grains in addition to insects. And when people would plant out rice, they tried to time it so that they wouldn't hit the migration of bobolinks into South Carolina, because if your field got overrun with bobolinks, your rice crop was ruined. So they got the name rice bird. Catesby, who lived during the 1700s, was the first to propose that birds actually migrated. And people didn't really understand what happened to birds in the wintertime. And he proposed that they flew distances, flew south for the winter. Before that, they thought they buried themselves in mud of ponds during the wintertime. That's what the English scientists thought in the 18th century. But the bobolink helped him to solve that puzzle, because Mark Catesby saw the bobolink on its migration in the Carolinas, but he also found the bobolink in the Bahamas. And he thought that the bobolink is moving north. And so the discovery of migration is also linked to this bird. And that's where Mark Catesby's idea of birds of passage, migrants, really got its start. Another contribution of early colonial era naturalists is understanding how our choices in land management have impacted the distribution and the abundance of plants around us. Even though this little plant may not look like much, it happens to be one of the rarest plants in the United States. This is American chapseed, Schwalbia americana. And Schwalbia, or American chapseed, used to have a range that went from New York and Massachusetts all the way to Texas. And it plays a critical role in understanding the importance of fire on the landscape and how that's changed since the first Europeans saw it here. And how long has it been known from South Carolina? Well, before Mark Catesby, an even earlier collector by the name of Joseph Lord, who settled Dorchester, just outside the Francis Marion National Forest here, was the first person I know of anywhere in the world to collect and dry and preserve a specimen of this plant, at least for European botanists to look at. Schwalbia americana used to be abundant in this type of habitat in fire-maintained forests, woodlands, longleaf pine, but other pinelands and other simply grasslands at that time from Massachusetts to Texas. American chapseed is extirpated, it's missing, it's gone extinct locally in many of the states that it used to occur in. The fact that this plant today is among the rarest plants in North America tells us a lot about how much change there's been in the choices that we've made in applying fire to the landscape. One of my favorite stories, related by Catesby himself in the Natural History, happened while he was in the Low Country at a residence, not way out in the wilderness. The homes of this time period are few and far between today. One example that survives is located at the South Carolina Botanical Garden. It originally was located in Berkeley County, South Carolina. It's the second oldest wood frame structure surviving in South Carolina today and was built in 1716, the Hanover House. The type of house that Mark Catesby would have stayed in may have been a little more luxurious than this in some cases, but the Hanover House provides us a great example of what homes were like in at least the French Huguenot settlements at that time. And this bedroom provides us with a great example of the type of bed that Mark Catesby would have spent the night in. And when he was at Colonel Blake's house, he had just left his bed when a servant came in a few minutes later to take out the bed sheets and clean the bed. And when she pulled back the bed sheets, imagine right there in the middle of the bed, a great big rattlesnake that had crawled up in the bed and probably spent the night coiled up right next to him. That would freak most of us out, but I'm not sure it really freaked out Mark Catesby, because you see, Catesby was one of the first people to recognize that the rattlesnake was not really an aggressor, and he gave the rattlesnake a fairly fair shake. Well, the type of bed that they slept on back in those days is rather interesting, because we're used to like box springs underneath beds today, but you had to have something similar to this to keep your bed really even sleepable back during that time, because see, beds back during Catesby's time were underlaying with roping, and this roping had to be tightened with a tool like this. So if you ever wondered where the term sleep tight came from, well, Catesby would have had to turn his bed each day to sleep tight, otherwise he'd sink down to the floor. Well, rattlesnakes, like the one that Catesby came across in that February day of 1723, have declined precipitously. They've been persecuted by man, and in fact, our largest species here in eastern North America, in fact, the largest of rattlesnakes in America, has declined more rapidly and more extensively than any other. And that's certainly a species that Catesby would have encountered in his travels in the coastal plain.
Though the eastern diamondback rattlesnake has suffered in many of its locations, there are still places where they're locally common. The Marine Corps, South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and researchers from Marshall University have partnered at the Parris Island Marine Corps Recruit Depot to study these snakes. An integral part of the research here is understanding the snake's movements, tracking the rattlesnakes in their natural habitat on the island. I went out with researcher Jonathan Cooley to see what we could find.
You can hear the little beep there.
Yeah, the signal's getting stronger. Probably walk in right here. It seems to be right in this area.
Okay.
There she is. Right there.
Oh my gosh. They really are well camouflaged.
They certainly are.
So how many of these animals are actually, do you have telemetry devices on out here?
We have 30 snakes right now being telemetered on Parris Island.
Yeah. And it's hard to believe. I mean, you said this snake was here yesterday. They can sit in the same spot for a while then.
Yeah, I mean, it's to their advantage to stay in one spot so they don't waste energy moving from one place to another because they're an ambush predator.
Right. That's so cool. You got a cool job.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I love my job.
Right there.
Professor Jamie Waldron leads the research at Marshall. She's an excellent resource to really get to know the rattlesnakes, their habits, characteristics, and how they interact with us humans.
I think that the first thing to notice about this snake is she doesn't seem to be coming after us.
No, she's doing, in fact, what they normally do, which is they want to avoid people. We're not a prey item.
Right.
You know, she's afraid of us, and so this is what they do.
That is a really pretty snake, too. It's magnificent.
And sometimes they'll stand their ground, but they'll hide their head because, you know, they're not aggressive animals.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool to see some of the similarities between what Mark Catesby talked about with rattlesnakes and the behavior that we've just witnessed here. I mean, we came upon a snake, we got a little close, she realizes we're here, and instead of really moving towards us or being aggressive, it's not. And that's exactly what Catesby noted about rattlesnakes. He was one of the few people who actually wrote a realistic story, and I guess the first realistic story that we know of about rattlesnakes, and he talks about them not being aggressive unless they're actually really messed with.
Right, and unfortunately, when most people come across rattlesnakes, they're in the road. And so when they're in the road, they feel vulnerable, and they're more likely to rattle.
Right.
They're more likely to try to scare you off because they know they're not hidden.
Even then, they're trying to scare you off.
But they're trying to scare you off.
They're not trying to bite you.
Right,
Yeah,
but that's the image most people have of rattlesnakes.
And that's a pretty big snake. How big? How long is this one?
About 130 centimeters.
130 centimeters, so about a little over 4 feet long, which to me is pretty big. But Catesby talks about rattlesnakes being 8 feet long.
And that's kind of the maximum for eastern diamondback rattlesnakes.
But not out of the question again.
Not out of the question. I've never been lucky enough to see one that big, but they can get quite large.
So during his time here, in the 1720s in South Carolina, things would have been a lot different, right?
Of course.
For rattlesnakes. What has happened to the population of snakes in general and the diamondback rattlesnake in particular since that time?
Well, eastern diamondback rattlesnakes are pine savanna specialists, you know, and we know that's the most imperiled ecosystem, and one of the most imperiled ecosystems in North America. And so if you're a specialist on that system, and it's gone, naturally, you're in trouble, right? Yeah. But rattlesnakes suffer disproportionately because they're rattlesnakes, and people just naturally are afraid of them. So there's not a lot of support for their conservation at times. The attitude of the only good snake's a dead snake.
Yeah, sure.
So, you know, they suffer because, number one, habitat loss.
Yep.
Number two, they're not the most charismatic species.
Yeah.
And number three, because there's actually collection pressures for this species as well.
And you can't forget also about the incredible barriers that we placed across these animals' habitats with roads, which is, it has to be one of the largest contributors.
And housing development, especially when you're in a marsh area or a coastal area like this.
Exactly. So, you know, this is not a savanna habitat, and so it's not the kind of place that, you know, I would expect to see a diamondback.
That's right, and the first time I came onto Parris Island, that's exactly what I said, that I'm not going to find any eastern diamondback rattlesnakes here. I find them on quail plantations, on pine savannas, but what you have here is you have marsh. And that is a good surrogate habitat
and
for
the marsh
eastern
edge
diamondbacks.
Is right there.
Right there.
Yeah,
the marsh edge is right over here. And what's interesting to note about diamondbacks is they're a signal of good habitat management. You know, they don't disperse very well. And even if you have habitat that looks like it's really good for diamondbacks, if there's been a lot of destruction historically, you're not going to have diamondbacks there. So if they're there, it's a good indicator that the habitat's been high quality for a long time. You're more likely to find endemic species where you find diamondbacks. Between the South Carolina DNR and between the Marine Corps here at Parris Island, we have learned a lot about diamondbacks. We know that they live a long time. Individuals can live over 30 years.
In the wild.
In the wild.
Yeah.
We have adult females. We caught them 1 year, 13 years later, we caught them again. They only grew a centimeter. So they persist. We know that they don't disperse. Adults in particular, once they're in a spot, they're unlikely to leave it. It takes them 7 years to reach reproductive maturity.
And do they reproduce every year? They
no,
don't, right?
No, about every 3 or 4 years. Males will breed every year, but a female, they have to build up their fat reserves, and that can take years.
Even as far back as the 1720s, Catesby had noted that these animals give live birth It's a little different than a live birth that a mammal would give, right?
Absolutely. They actually carry their eggs. So they incubate eggs.
Yep.
And then the eggs hatch internally.
Right.
And then the babies are
And
born.
there's a term for that. It's called
Ovoviviparity.
ovoviviparity.
Ovoviviparity, yes.
Ovo meaning egg and viviparity
Yes,
meaning giving
live
live
birth.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Incredible. I just feel so fortunate to be able to come to this place. First of all, I just can't thank you enough, and to see these guys. Just absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
Keep up the good
Amazing
work.
animals. Thank you very much.
Rattlesnakes aren't the only species that impressed Catesby in coastal Carolina. He made numerous discoveries in the coastal plain and writes extensively also about the native people here. The age of discovery isn't over. We're still making discoveries today and learning amazing things about how our choices impact the world and just how long the world remembers us. This may not be exactly what you think the Piedmont of the Carolinas looks like, but in Catesby's day, in the 1720s, this may have been the most common habitat in the Piedmont. Mark Catesby journeyed to the upstate of South Carolina twice in the 1720s, and what he describes and what he collected here is beginning to really shed light on what Carolina was, what it is today, and how we move forward in conserving the biodiversity that we have. Join me on today's expedition as we continue to rediscover Catesby's Carolina. Mark Catesby was an 18th century British naturalist. He journeyed to Carolina in 1722 and based his explorations from Charleston. At this time, the British settlements extended inland only about 60 miles from the coast. Beyond this, most of Carolina was managed and controlled by Native Americans. It was into this territory, whose customs were barely known by Europeans, that Catesby walked hundreds of miles, not once, but twice, in 1723 and again in 1724. He traveled once in the spring and again in the autumn to observe a full range of the plants and animals in the region. His notes and his collections, combined with the words that he printed in the Natural History, can allow us a glimpse into a very different look at what Carolina was like at the dawn of the dramatic change that would come from European subjugation of the land. His contributions help us to better understand the human role in shaping our continent. The question we have to ask is what's natural today always been natural? Or maybe we even need to ask the question, what natural really means? It turns out that colonial era naturalists like Mark Catesby can help us to get at what is natural, and if there really is such a thing as nature without man. Well, you go out on a warm summer day and just listen to the birds around you, you start to pick up on some of the changes that have happened since Catesby was here. Most of us, when we walk out into what we consider to be natural, we'd be walking out into a forest like this. And maybe if you're listening, and it's the springtime, you might hear something like a Baltimore oriole singing from the trees in your yard. And that makes sense because Baltimore orioles like areas like backyards. They like scattered trees and kind of grassy areas in between. Well, if you listen in a forest like this, you might catch the sound of an ovenbird, or maybe see and hear both the brilliant red and the beautiful song of a scarlet tanager. You know, these two birds are really interesting because they need a lot of space of older growth forest to successfully produce young. These aren't backyard birds. These are birds that need, well, in the case of the ovenbird, well over 100 acres of mature 80-plus-year-old trees to successfully raise one nest of young. And there's the other class of birds, things like meadowlarks, prairie warblers, yellow-breasted chats, and the list goes on. Those things that like to live in areas that people in the eastern United States have really messed with. Places like cow fields, clear cuts, power line clearings. Places we think of having the impact of a heavy hand of humans. Well, what I've done for you there is illustrate 3 different ecological guilds of birds. The Baltimore oriole represents a bird that likes backyards.
The scarlet tanager and the ovenbird are old-growth forest birds, and the meadowlark is a great example of what we call an early successional bird, one that likes open, disturbed areas. Among those three ecological guilds, which one do you think is doing worse today than it did in Catesby's time? The result might astound you. Most of you are thinking, oh gosh, it's got to be the old-growth forest bird because we simply have to preserve these trees, they're all disappearing. And you'd be wrong. It's not the backyard, it's not the old-growth forest bird. The birds that here are doing the worst are the same that are doing the worst worldwide. Those that occupy early successional habitats, birds like the meadowlark. A bird that Catesby painted a beautiful picture of in the Natural History. The meadowlark population has declined by a huge percentage over the last 50 years. And when we go to think about why a bird that liked open areas like cow fields would have declined so much in the past couple decades, all we have to think of are the choices that we've made in our lives. And from the time of Catesby, we've seen a dramatic change and a dramatic loss of early successional habitats. Well, it wasn't all cow fields in Catesby's day, and we certainly didn't have huge clear cuts. So when we actually want to explore what Catesby was visiting, the kind of places he would go, we can get clues from even our, today, closed-in forests. Taking a walk in the woods with me can be a little bit different because you see, when I'm out in the woods, I'm always trying to establish the history. I'm trying to understand the landscape. And in old stands of forest here in South Carolina, we can reestablish much of the past 200, 250 years of change in our Piedmont forests. And this old granddaddy I'm standing next to right now is our champion here in this patch of really older growth forest that we have at the South Carolina Botanical Garden. This is a shortleaf pine, and it's not the only large shortleaf pine we have out here. We have 6 or 7 enormous shortleaf pines like this one, right here in this patch of really old woodland. And these shortleaf pine are taller than anything else in the forest. Well, it's no coincidence that shortleaf pine are the oldest trees in this forest today. You see, shortleaf pine is what we call an early successional species. It doesn't compete well with other trees, and it doesn't grow well in shade when it's young. You see no small shortleaf pine in this forest today. But if we dialed back the clock 200 plus years, what we would have seen here are scattered and widely spaced shortleaf pine growing in a woodland, not a forest, a habitat that we would call today a savanna. Well, the shortleaf pine were growing like that because shortleaf pine do very well in Piedmont ecosystems that have fairly frequent fire. And we actually can see evidence of fire, old fires, as scars still visible today on the bark of some of these ancient shortleaf pine. This pine we know is more than 240 years old. We've cored it. We've looked at the rings inside this tree. Count the rings and you find out how old these trees are. And the reason that these shortleaf pines survived here is because this was on the edge of John C. Calhoun's cattle field back in the 1800s. And this tree is old enough that John C. Calhoun himself could have walked underneath this tree. Thomas Green Clemson could have walked underneath this tree. And today, here we are walking under this tree. Well, why were they here? No, they were here because Native Americans were burning the landscape. And when they burned the landscape, it kept out a lot of the later successional species, a lot of the hardwoods that are more susceptible to the impacts of fire. And during the years when a small pine could get a little bit of a head start and didn't get burned, they would get tall enough that they could survive the fire. So we essentially had a habitat here that was constantly in that early successional state, kept that way by the hand of humans igniting fire in this landscape. Now, how has it changed? Because today, you'd walk into this forest and you'd say it's pretty much like any other hardwood forest anywhere in the Piedmont. We do have these giant scattered shortleaf pine, but we also have 120, 140 plus year old oaks and hickories in this forest. You see, the oaks and hickories, they came up when fire was removed from this forest system. And they came up like this in any patch that was left. And as the oak and hickory and sourwood and sweet gum and all of the hardwoods filled in this habitat, They create a dense shade in the understory. And in that dense shade, only a few species are capable of surviving and growing. And the one that is today taking over these slopes is American beech. American beech is the exact opposite of the shortleaf pine. It's what we call a late successional species. It needs to come up in the shade, and as it grows very slowly. It creates what we often used to call a climax community, a community that will stay the same, pretty much perpetual beech trees, until a major disturbance is introduced into the system. And that disturbance for us here in the eastern United States has traditionally been fire. Whether that's lightning strike or what we now know was the much more frequent ignition source of human beings, thanks to people like Mark Catesby. It turns out there's not a single species that can only be found in just these relatively recent creations, these hardwood forests that today blanket the slopes. To find those endemics, we need to go to power line right-of-ways, roadsides, places that approximate the landscape that Mark Catesby walked through. If we could dial back the clock about 300 years, this is the kind of habitat that Mark Catesby would have expected and he would have been familiar with here in the Piedmont of the Carolinas. And this sort of habitat, a blackjack oak, post oak savanna, is not what we think about being typically in the Piedmont of the Carolinas. We think about habitats like this being in places like central or northern Oklahoma. Why were they here? Well, this habitat itself is called a savanna because it has widely spaced trees and lots of grassy understory, grasses and herbs predominantly underneath there. These trees, these scrubby, slow-growing trees, are here because they're fire adapted. They can withstand fire. And what's more, they don't compete well with the taller, faster growing forest trees that we think of as typical in this part of South Carolina today. Well, the two oaks that dominate this habitat are really kind of cool. The post oak is called post oak because of the shape of the leaf. The leaf is shaped in a well-developed specimen like a cross. And the blackjack oak, well, apparently resembles a medieval instrument of destruction, I guess, a blackjack. And this blackjack oak leaf that I'm holding right here almost exactly resembles that Mark Catesby himself painted and included in the etchings that are in the natural history. When we read the way Mark Catesby described the Piedmont, he described vast savannas. As a matter of fact, he talked about some things we don't think about being here. He talked about things like bison and elk, animals that we think of being in grasslands, not in the forests of the Piedmont. Well, the bison and elk were here because the vast oak hickory forests of the Piedmont were not here back in those days. Catesby tells us why this habitat existed. He mentions that the Native Americans would burn every single spring. They did it to promote the grass, to keep the trees really widely spaced like we see here in this incredible savanna system. When they promoted the grass, they promoted the bison, the elk, the deer, the quail, the turkeys, the things that made their lives better, that made their lives easier. They were managing the habitat, and they were doing this for thousands of years before Europeans came on the scene. I always find it uncanny how Mark Catesby had the knack for not just coming across and finding the common things, but finding the rare things. As a matter of fact, what today are oftentimes the rarest of the rare, and this plant right here is a great example of that. This is smooth coneflower, and smooth coneflower today is a federally threatened species. It's found still in its largest numbers right here in this part of South Carolina, the same part that Mark Catesby walked through. He describes this plant as growing hundreds of miles up the Savannah River from its mouth, and that's where we are today. He describes it as growing on the banks of the Savannah, which back in those days would have been fire-maintained open woodland, which is the habitat of this species, and it's also why this plant is so rare today. This plant suffers from habitat loss, and it's not just loss of the habitat to development, but it's loss to agriculture and it's loss to an absence of the process that kept it here, and that's fire. These plants don't look much different. As a matter of fact, his illustration of this plant looks almost exactly like the one that I have in my hand. It shows these outer flowers, which really are flowers, not petals. We oftentimes think of things in the aster family as having one big flower, but it's actually an aggregation of many flowers, disc flowers in the center, and then these ray flowers on the outside. And he describes these as being deeply notched. And indeed, when you look at them, you can see that deep notch on the tip of each one of those ray flowers. And when you compare what's in my hand to what Mark Catesby colored in his etchings, they're almost identical. It's just neat to think that so many things that Mark Catesby found, today we can still find them growing hundreds of years later in almost the identical location. There's very few places where the descriptions of those early explorers of the Carolinas and elsewhere in the southeast that describe these grasslands, savannas as they called them, really can be visualized, but this is one of them right here in the South Carolina Botanical Garden. And when you read stories about explorers having grasses taller than a horse's head in the South today, that seems crazy. But we look at this, I mean, this is like a 10, 12 foot tall stalk of big bluestem. And you just don't see that growing that tall here in this part of South Carolina, at least in the upstate. And the reason you don't see these grasses getting to such huge height here is because they're existing in places where light still penetrates down to the ground level, where really we've had a management style that's been a surrogate for fire. And the reason they don't get this high is because wherever they're growing today in the Piedmont, they're probably not growing on topsoil. Because today in the Piedmont, we really are stuck with just brick hard red clay, and that's subsoil. You see, we lost anywhere from 12 to 18 inches of deep, dark, rich topsoil here with the cultivation of cotton and other crops, caused it to wash off the landscape. And what we're left with is nothing like the soils that the grasses were growing on back when Catesby walked through this area. Catesby's description of the soils and the area and the richness of the area is almost unfathomable today. But on this site here in the South Carolina Botanical Garden, where we've reestablished a Piedmont prairie ecosystem, we've established it on a little 9-acre window of virgin soils. And when you look at these soils that never saw the plow, you can see what life in the Piedmont would have been like if we had those soils today. We've got here almost 4 feet of deep, dark, rich soil on this site. How did that happen? How did this little corner of the Piedmont escape plowing? Well, what happened here was that this, formerly part of the estate of John C. Calhoun, was a cattle pasture. When Thomas Green Clemson took it over, it was a cattle pasture. When Clemson University took it over, cattle pasture. And then it was an orchard for just a few years before it got turned over and became part of the South Carolina Botanical Garden. Right here in this restored Piedmont Prairie site, we have Georgia aster, Schweinetz's sunflower, and even Michaux's sumac. And all those can be found in this sort of habitat. And at one time, this habitat was the predominant habitat over much of the Piedmont of the Carolinas. Sounds weird today to think of this being natural. Then it was natural. Today, it's all but gone. A Piedmont filled with bison and elk being pursued by wolves sounds as foreign to us today as a Piedmont that's filled with nothing but trees would be to Mark Catesby. Mark Catesby and other early explorers to this area really reinforce how important humans were for igniting fire in this landscape. Remember, he said the woods were totally destroyed. Well, were they really destroyed? There's a reason why this is the habitat where we find most of our true Piedmont endemics. This was a common habitat. And their concept, the European concept of fire, was vastly different than what reality on the ground was. To see how our native Piedmont flora actually responds to fire, we need to burn something. So that's exactly what we do every single early spring, just like the Native Americans did right here at the South Carolina Botanical Garden. So if we come full circle, right back to the forest we started in, we can see that all along the way, every habitat that occupied this particular piece of ground from the time of Catesby till today really involved the hand of humans. So you tell me, which one is natural? The prairie, the cotton field, the forest? You can't take humans out of the equation and still have natural here in this part of the Piedmont, at least since the end of the last ice age. So to me, they're all natural because they all include our choices. And today we have a choice of whether or not we're going to promote those things that are truly unique to the Piedmont. Those plants like the smooth coneflower, the Georgia aster, the Schweinetz's sunflower, those things that require open habitats, that required our hand igniting the landscape to put fire back in the landscape. We have to decide whether or not there's a place for them in what we consider natural and what we consider our responsibility and our role to be today. It's amazing what you can learn from a naturalist that roamed these very woods almost 300 years ago. Catesby wrote extensively about the Native American cultures, and he certainly experienced their customs firsthand. The lasting impact of the choices our Native people had on the land is apparent in the Piedmont today, but their choices, even small choices that individuals made on the landscape thousands of years ago, continue to have a dramatic impact on the land today. I can think of no better place to see this than on our sea islands. An incredible example that was the focus of our first program over a decade ago, and still the most poignant example I can think of to illustrate just how long the world remembers you and your choices. Here, the voices of those Native Americans speak even louder than Catesby. You can read the forest to find shell sites, sites where Native Americans most of the time have deposited shell, even if it isn't visible at the surface. So the forest that I'm standing in right now is only a few hundred feet from the marsh, but it looks completely different from your typical maritime forest. The ground is completely carpeted with brilliant green of what looks like grasses. About half of them are grasses and half of them are sedges. And the species themselves of the grasses and sedges are absolutely typical of sites on shell. And this one, with this long dangling flower, is Carex baziantha, and I haven't seen this one probably since the last time I was on this island, because it's absolutely restricted to areas where limestone or shell are right at the surface, high pH soil. And as you raise the pH of the soil, you have less and less of this sort of slow-growing evergreen species that you think of being on acid soils that are typical of the coastal plain. And you find more things that are deciduous, like the enormous basswood that's right above us here, and all of this greenery on the herbaceous layer, all the grasses, the sedges, the ferns, and the broadleaf plants that make up this habitat. It looks a lot like a tropical hammock, and it shares a lot in common with a tropical hammock. Just really cool to see, and cool to see some old friends that I haven't seen for a long time. And again, it's a really cool part of our natural history, and one that remains hidden because they're on these isolated sea islands that people don't really get to. And you have to look pretty hard to recognize something as sort of mundane as this as being important. So here we are in the middle of a hammock forest, just meters from the marsh. And I'm standing in a forest of sugar maple trees. Southern sugar maples. This plant shouldn't really grow on the sea islands of South Carolina. This is a plant we find in the Piedmont or up in the mountains, and usually associated with nutrient-rich deciduous forests. And we're finding it here on the outer coastal plain of South Carolina. Well, we've talked all about how Carolina has changed from the time that Catesby visited, but we haven't really brought it all together to understand how important you are in the equation going forward into the future. And sugar maple can do that for us. You see, these sugar maples are growing here because of the shell that's in the soil. This island is covered with these little mounds of shell. And if we look right at the base of the sugar maple trees, you can see the shell that they're pushing out of the ground, and that shell contains calcium carbonate. It's lime. And here in South Carolina in the outer coastal plain, our soils are inherently very acid. And that highly acid soil promotes evergreen species like live oaks and junipers and palmettos, not fast-growing deciduous trees like sugar maple. And what's more, here where the shell is, we also find things you find nowhere else in South Carolina except where you have these shell middens and shell mounds. Things like Godfrey's swamp privet, leafless swallowwort, shell-midden morning glory. You find them here and really nowhere else in the state. And they're all here because of the shell, and that shell was put here by people. And in the case of this mound, probably 4,000, 5,000 plus years ago. One of my favorite sites over in Charleston County has recently been dated to 5,200 years ago, and it also contains the sugar maple. Throw down a shell and you change the world. Think about the power behind that. We oftentimes feel like we're insignificant, like our choices don't matter. How much bigger have your choices been than to throw a shell on the ground, change the soil chemistry, and 5,000 years from now, maybe a sugar maple instead of a live oak grows there? It's a powerful story, and it really wraps together and ties up everything our show is about, and everything that we can learn really poignantly from Catesby's writings, specimens, and studies. And the really cool part about this story is we usually think about the negative things that we do to the environment, our negative interactions. But here's an example where something that people did 5,000 years ago has continued to increase diversity and increase the quality of life. It's all about the types of choices we make. Your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson may not know who you were, but the world, it never forgets your choices. The Carolina that Catesby knew was at once very different and yet similar to the Carolina we know today. His world was shaped by the choices that people were making every day on the landscape. And those choices continue to shape the world around us today. What we can learn from Catesby, the most important thing we can take from Catesby, is that personal choice matters. You will change the world simply by existing. I'm Patrick McMillan, wishing you your own exciting expedition.